Okay, so picking up where I left off, how can the Constitution be informally changed? The first step would be for something that we're going to talk about a lot in this course, which is judicial interpretation, or better known as judicial review. And so, judicial review is the idea that the courts, as established in the landmark Supreme Court case of Marbury v. Madison, which many of you probably heard in US history, that in Marbury v. Madison, the Supreme Court originally gave rise to this premise that federal courts were the ones who were able to establish something as unconstitutional, that they could look at a law, look at a congressional action, look at a presidential action, and say, no, this is out of bounds with what the Constitution means or what the Constitution says. And so this is a popular misnomer for the Supreme Court and federal courts in general, um, because people think that the courts can just decide whatever they want. But really, federal courts are not allowed to just decide whatever they want. Everything that they decide has to be defended and argued from the basis of the Constitution. Does the Constitution allow this action by Congress or the president or the bureaucracy or an individual? Does this action stand in line with the Constitution? And so this is the principle of judicial review, that courts get to establish constitutionality of something. And that basically this action, every time it's invoked, where a court, a federal court, says, I'm sorry, but no, this is out of bounds. The Constitution does not allow you to do it. That every time this happens, the Constitution sort of adapts, and from that point on, that becomes an established sort of principle, right? It is precedent at that point. And so when it happens again, the Constitution has effectively changed meaning because it has been interpreted as saying no. And so when this happens, this is changing the Constitution informally, because every time the Supreme Court says, "I'm sorry, but even though the Second Amendment allows you to have guns, we do not believe that the Second Amendment allows you to have bazookas." Right? And so suddenly, when the Supreme Court says, no, that is not covered by the Second Amendment, you can't have a bazooka, sir, suddenly the Constitution has changed what it's talking about. And so, not formally, like nobody added an addendum and then rewrit the Constitution, but it has definitely changed informally. Another big way that the Constitution can be changed informally is just by the changing nature of political practice, right? Basically, we quite often talk about politics and actions of government with this idea of this word incrementalism, that basically things change incrementally, right? That every year or every 10 years, what was allowable 10 years ago has been stretched a little bit further. And so, just like children, political parties and politicians and Congress and the president, more than anyone else, is going to invoke their power and act in such a way that is basically saying, are you going to let me do this? Can I get away with this? Is anyone going to call me on this crap? And when Congress or the president or somebody does something and is not checked on that through checks and balances, it's not checked in the courts, it's not, Congress isn't holding the president accountable, then every time that happens, the Constitution is getting stretched too through increment. Blatantly unconstitutional 30 years earlier is suddenly allowable, right? And this changes, we're going to see a lot of instances of this over the years, but perhaps maybe nothing exemplifies this better than obscenity, right? The First Amendment establishes freedom of speech for private citizens, that we as citizens are not allowed to have our speech limited by the government. But as with anything, there are limits to this freedom of speech. And the most famous one we oftentimes say is, you can't yell fire in a crowded theater. Your freedom of speech does not supersede other people's rights to safety. But it's much more complex than that, right? Because even though it's easy to say we have freedom of speech, there's a mountain of exceptions. And that, constitutional amendment has been challenged
God knows how many times, thousands of times. And so, like back in the 60s and the 70s, um, you couldn't say any swear words in public. You couldn't name restaurants, funny plays on swear words. You couldn't say certain things on TV. And, that was allowable. The Constitution, and the Supreme Court said, that's allowable. The majority of the society that we live in says this is obscene, and therefore you're not allowed to say it. And even though we have freedom of speech, your freedom of speech does not allow you to just go into an elementary school and yell the F word as loud as you want, right? But that has also changed over time, because what was considered obscene in the 1960s and 70s barely bats people's eyes these days. Society changes, and as the government that reflects society changes, then our political practices change. And, what maybe Congress 50 years ago would have called the president out and said, no, bad president, you can't do that. Nowadays, Congress is sort of allowing the president to do lots of things. And so these political, changes have inadvertently shaped the Constitution, because, just like with real society, when you let somebody get away with something, or you let somebody do something, or, what bothers you changes over time, you can't then just, after allowing that for 20 years, suddenly say, psych, and go back in time. And so, as political practices have changed, the Constitution and what it means and what its limits are has also changed. Moving forward, and maybe give you some more examples, like political parties were not a part of the original Constitution. There is no mention of political parties in the Constitution. I'll say that again because it's a frequent AP exam question, right? But the Constitution does not make mention of political parties in any way whatsoever. And they are only inferred in the Federalist Papers in number 10 when we're talking about factions, but still no actual mention. But, as we've gone on, we've really kind of established ourselves as this two-party state where Democrats and Republicans are pretty entrenched and a part of our government. And, that has sort of changed the Constitution. We've also seen the Electoral College. The Constitution literally says, if you go directly by its words, that state legislatures will choose wise electors, right? That will basically be tasked with being the check on an ill-informed public to elect our president. A lot of people think that voters elect the president. Voters do not elect the president. Voters say what we want, and then the electors for each state are supposed to then go with what the voters in their state said. But that, again, that mention is not made clear in the Constitution, and it's very hazy. But nowadays in 2020, we pretty much have established this idea that, political parties themselves pick their electors, and the electors are basically, mandated to vote exactly how the voters of the state say. But the Constitution doesn't say that. And so this changing political practice and the evolution of beliefs in political practice has changed the nature of the Constitution. Moving on, the last thing we want to say, in addition to like judicial interpretation and precedent from court rulings, and then the changing political practice and changing context, is the simple fact that the world is different today in 2020 than it was 250 years ago, in 1780 something. And this changing global context makes it very difficult to guess at what the founding fathers meant here. And which to me makes the argument of we need to be literalists, we need to go by literally what the Constitution says, makes it a very difficult argument to win, because the electors had no way of predicting the internet. They had no way of predicting supersonic jet fighters. They had no way of predicting the atomic bomb. They had no way of predicting germ warfare that could craft a virus that could wipe out all of humanity in a week. And so, the changing global context has altered what the Constitution actually means or represents. In 1780, when it was created, the US was pretty weak, right? We were basically no better or worse than Switzerland. And yet, over the last 240 years, 250 years, we've evolved into, a superpower that, depending on when you're asking in history, has been unchecked. And so, this has demanded in our superpower role that we are more active in foreign policy. We are more active at doing things abroad and keeping the world safe and looking out for our interests in far off places. But the Constitution doesn't really speak on that very much. It just basically says that the president has the powers of commander in chief, and the president has the powers to keep Americans safe and protect national security. And so those very limited words have been stretched and changed given the changing nature of the United States to basically give the president huge ranges of powers that, quite frankly, would have made the founding fathers very uncomfortable. But the world is different today, and so when you say the president has the power, for national security and to protect America, that obviously means different things when we are the superpower in an atomic energy age than it did in 1787 when we had very little and we traveled by boat. Um, that's the specific one. The presidential power increases. We've also seen that even in giving the president more ranges of power, both domestically, internally. The opposite of domestic would be foreign. So the president's power has grown at home as well as, changing nature and changing political realities have kind of slowly but surely changed what, when the Constitution was made, the founding fathers really aimed for the Congress, the legislature branch to be the strongest. But over the last 240 years, we've definitely got to the place where the Congress has gotten weaker over time, and the presidency has gotten stronger. And that has changed the nature of the Constitution. These are all informal changes. You can't look them up anywhere in the Constitution. But all of these things, changing global context, changing political practices, and judicial interpretation, have changed the way the Constitution is read. Last slide here today, we're going to go on, is does the Constitution directly control everything? And this is a debate. This is a classic debate between liberals and conservatives, Republicans and Democrats, is what is the scope and the limits of constitutional power? And I think the beginning response to this is the simple statement that the Constitution, I said 16,000 words earlier, it's actually only 8,000 words. And so to put that simply, that's 16 pages typed in Google Docs. That means that the entire United States and its 350 million people, the most powerful nation in the world, is run on a document of only 16 typed Google Doc pages. That's pretty incredible. And so, obviously, in such a short document, you can't account for everything that could, possibly go wrong. It's not a laundry list of the, 8 million different laws controlling all parts of our society, but instead it provides a skeleton. It provides a framework that lists, this is what the roles are. This is the limits of power. This is your responsibility and this is your responsibility. And this is your responsibility to check that other person's responsibility. And so this framework, this skeleton of the Constitution, essentially guides the nation and gives rise to this argument that the Constitution is, because it's only 8,000 words and because it has been stretched and adapted over so many years to basically provide the foundation of everything, is that it is meant to be a living document. A living document meaning it grows, it changes, it evolves, and that each generation, under this theory of a living document theory, each generation basically places the Constitution in the context of their time. And so, how the Constitution was read in 1820 is not going to be the same as 1920, which is not going to be the same as 2020. And so, we look at what's our world going on around us, and how does that basically give meaning to the words within this Constitution, within the 8,000 pages. Because, quite frankly, a lot of the things that we consider as fundamental parts of our government that everyone would say, yes, it's in there, like the right to privacy. There's no right to privacy. Federal courts, number of Supreme Court justices, cabinet departments. None of these things are in the Constitution, but they have evolved over time. And, eventually the Constitution is basically safeguarding and providing limits and frameworks for everything. And this is the argument that basically, because the Constitution can be stretched, it gives it flexibility. And this flexibility keeps it from ever breaking or falling apart. It's why they make earthquake proof buildings able to bend, because rigid buildings break. And so, this is the argument for that living document theory. And the counter argument would be the following: